A significant part of the work that we're going to do together will be built around the idea of Christian practices. Christian practices are crucial to our work, so we need to introduce you to them, but we probably also need to start simply by saying, why are they important? To do that, let's step back and talk about what it is we're trying to accomplish together. The first thing we need to do is look at the problem we're trying to solve. The problem is that the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. If that's the case, we're going to need to recalibrate. That's what we mean by innovation. And anytime you recalibrate, you adjust yourself so that you match a particular standard, like changing the way in which you dance so that you match the tune, the pace of the music, the meter of the music that's going on. You need to be attuned to it. And we need to be attuned to the never-changing gospel and attuned to the ever-changing people that have been entrusted to our care. In other conversations, we've already looked at the idea that we need to be listening to the people entrusted to our care. This is the conversation we're going to have about how to attune ourselves to the never-changing gospel. The way we can think about it is that when you calibrate yourself to a standard. We're going to need to calibrate ourselves to two standards at the exact same time. One is the people that will be entrusted to our care. This will allow us to maintain our connection to the ever-changing culture. But the other standard is the practices, the Christian practices. And this will allow us to remain anchored in the never-changing gospel. That's why we're having a conversation today about Christian practices. Let me give you some examples of Christian practices. Prayer is a Christian practice. Worship, testimony, almsgiving, Sabbath. Each of these is an example of a Christian practice. But the question becomes, why is worship a Christian practice, but singing is not a Christian practice? We need to talk about what the characteristics are of practices if we're going to be able to use them in order to innovate. So the first characteristic of a Christian practice is that we think of practices as actions that Christians have repeated for generations. They constitute Christianity. Christians have always engaged in these practices. There's never been a time when there was a Christian church where we didn't engage in prayer or worship or testimony or Sabbath. So the first thing we have to recognize is that they've been repeated for generations. The second thing is that they are an end unto themselves. They're not a means to a greater end. This is how singing is different than worship. Singing is not a practice. Worship is the practice. The purpose of singing in our church is worship. If we were to gather a bunch of Christians together who happened to be interested in the musical Hamilton, and we were singing songs from Hamilton, that would not be worship. That would be singing. It would be a good thing. We have a good time doing it, but it's not worth it. Worship. Worship is designed to bring honor to God, to focus on God, to thank God, to bless God. We engage in singing in order to accomplish worship. Worship is the greater end. Worship is not a means to a greater end. It is an end in of itself. It is automatically good. If I tell you that what we're going to do today is we're going to do something and the purpose of that is worship, I don't expect any Christian to go, well, why is that important? Christians have been worshiping for generations. There is no such thing as a Christian community that does not engage in worship. Worship is part of what constitutes being a Christian. The third characteristic of Christian practices is that they have standards. Think, for example, about generosity or about almsgiving. There's a good way to practice almsgiving, and there's a bad way to practice almsgiving. Jesus talked about this himself. If we give to the poor, or if we give to help the poor or to be generous, that is a good way of practicing almsgiving. But if we give in order to look good, that's a bad way. Jesus says, I tell you, that person has already received their reward. There's a good way to be almsgiving, there's a bad way to do almsgiving, but the point here is that Christian practices have standards, and there's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it. We'll use some of those standards in a moment. The fourth characteristic of Christian practices is that the form of the practice can change over time. Think about worship, for example. In medieval times, they used Gregorian chants, and they worshiped God by singing in Latin, or even the worship service for 1,000 years was often in Latin, with the priest saying things in Latin that the people of God may or may not have understood, but that was all considered to be part of worship. We don't do that worship that way anymore. In some of our traditions, we might use organ music. There was a time in the late 19th century when organs were introduced into Christian worship, and it was extremely controversial. And Christians thought, many Christians argued, oh, that's ostentation. That's something that goes against the plain sense of where worship should not be about any kind of ostentation, but just focus on God. Then a generation ago, guitars were introduced, and all of a sudden they were starting to replace organ music, and that was controversial. The point here is that the way we go about worship can change over time, and that gives us flexibility. Think about generosity that we just talked about. When Jesus was pointing to people who were practicing generosity or almsgiving, they were thinking of giving coins to the poor. Nowadays, some of us might write checks to some kind of an agency, or use PayPal or a debit card in order to practice our generosity. That's something that would be unheard of in previous generations, but it still constitutes part of what we think of as the larger practice of generosity, or the larger practice of almsgiving. The form of the practice can change over time. But there's also pitfalls that can be attached to Christian practices, and we want to talk about two of them. The first one deals with something we're going to call external goods. External goods are benefits that accrue as a byproduct of the practice. Think, for example, of Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa engaged in care for the poor, and there was an internal good that caring for the poor was a good that was an end in of itself. That's what scholars would call an internal good. You didn't have to justify it. You didn't have to explain why caring for the poor was a good thing. We all recognize that. So that was an internal good. The pitfall, however, is that she did receive external goods. In this particular case, she became famous. She got notoriety. Now, she didn't do almsgiving. She didn't do caring for the poor in order to make herself famous, but along the way it kind of happened. You can imagine, however, where sometimes there are people who start out doing things for the right reason, and the external goods, the byproducts that come to them, take over, and that becomes a pitfall that makes it we have to be careful of as we engage in Christian practices. The other pitfall is the idea of distortion, misusing a practice. Think about the practice, for example, of discernment. If I am engaged in the process of discernment, one of the things that my goal is to find the will of God. So if I engage in discernment, that means listening to God, listening to Scripture, listening to other Christians. All those things are good parts of discernment. Now let's imagine that I've been engaged in discernment and I come across a situation where, I was working with a group one time where somebody said, well, we're going to do a practice of discernment, but it became very clear that really what they were using was the process of discernment as a masquerade in order to just get what they wanted. That was a distortion of discernment. That doesn't indict the concept of discernment, but what it does is it puts us in a place where we have to be careful about it. So there are 5 things we need to know about practices: that they are actions that Christians have repeated for generations. They are an end unto themselves. They're not a means to a greater end. This is what scholars call the internal good of a practice. They have standards. The form of the practice can change over time, and they have pitfalls that we need to avoid. We now know a little bit about practices. Let's talk a little bit more about how to use them.